I was able to get through all the class cards, but unfortunately the expansion did drop before I was able to get through the neutrals, so let's just try to power through these real quick. Luckily most of them are trash, so there probably won't be too much to say. First up is Acherus Veteran. This is kind of reminiscent of Abusive Sergeant before it got nerfed, but this is no Abusive Sergeant. Abusive Sergeant gives +2 attack this turn, this gives +1 attack permanently, but usually when you're giving something plus attack like that, you're using it to trade, so the difference between permanent and temporary attack is usually pretty insignificant. So this is worse than old Abusive Sergeant, but it does still seem reasonable in a zoo style of deck that wants to do a lot of trading. However, one of the strengths of Abusive Sergeant was it was really good later in the game, but on turn 1 if you needed the 1-drop you could just play it as a 1 mana 2/1. You can do that with this card, but unfortunately a 1 mana 2/1 is not really what it used to be. It was never great, but particularly now that Patches is in every aggro deck, I can't really imagine this card seeing too much play. But maybe after Patches rotates out, this thing will have a chance. It's a very reasonable card, it just lines up really poorly against the best 1-drops in the game, which are things that summon Patches, and Mana Worm. So we've got Bloodworm, which is a severely understated minion with lifesteal. As a 5 mana 4/4, this thing is going to get one shot like every time you put it on the board. Would you play a 5 mana 4/4 heal your hero for 4? Probably not. If you're going to play a card like that, Cult Apothecary probably looks a little bit better, and that card has turned out to be pretty bad. If you do manage to get this to stick on the board and it can heal you for a bunch, that could be really valuable to, say, a Warlock that really values the healing. This is also a beast, so maybe it has a place in Hunter. Hunter normally can't heal, and that's one of the many reasons Control Hunter was never a thing. Maybe this finds a spot in a deck that really desperately needs healing and doesn't care how bad the card is, but it's a 5 mana 4/4, so it's probably trash. Next up we have Bonemare. A lot of people seem to think this card is pretty strong. I think it kinda sucks. It's tempting to say that Blessing of Kings is worth 4 mana, so this is a 3 mana 5/5, and it also has Taunt. But the thing about Blessing of Kings is when you play it on turn 4, your minion is definitely going to be the biggest thing in play. If you play this thing on turn 7, the 5/5 is never going to be the biggest thing in play. The thing you gave +4/+4 to is probably never going to be the biggest thing in play. You also kind of need to be playing this in a class that can reliably have minions on the board. So first you look at like Shaman and Paladin. Paladin definitely would rather just play Spike Ridge Steed. Once you're getting up to 7 mana, they just have better cards. And Shaman really just doesn't have much of a use for this. Even if you do get it to land, it's just a pile of stats, and once you start getting up to this mana cost, a pile of stats really just isn't good enough. It's a reasonable enough card, but I can't imagine a constructed deck where I would ever want to spend 7 mana on this thing. Cobalt Scalebane, card is pretty reasonable, 5 mana 5/5 is okay. I'd say this is probably unplayable without the dragon tag, but there aren't that many dragons in standard right now, so maybe if you're playing a dragon deck, this is like a 1 of in that list. I think probably in that list, you're just going for Bone Drake as your dragon that you don't really want to play, but you have to play anyway, and I think that'll probably be enough. But the only current dragon deck is Dragon Priest. The +3 attack buff off this card is pretty good on Netherspite Historian or Northshire Cleric, but generally things that give plus attack are good when you can use them to trade, and since this is at the end of the turn, you can't really do that. Maybe this does end up seeing play in some kind of aggro list that actually doesn't care that this is a dragon, just because 5 mana 5/5 is pretty reasonable on turn 5. And if you've just got some like Fireflies or something on the board, the +3 attack from this could be pretty good. But in general, I think this is probably outclassed. If you're playing an aggro deck, you could play a 5 mana 8/8, and this is kind of a 5 mana 8/5. Seems reasonable though. Deadscale Knight is a 1 mana 1/1. It has lifesteal, but it has 1 power, so you're healing for 1. It's a Murloc, but in a Murloc deck, do you really want lifesteal? You probably just want to be killing your opponent. If you're playing a Murloc deck that's just desperate for more 1 mana Murlocs, there's already like Murloc Raider that doesn't see any play. I find it very unlikely that this card would ever see play in or out of a Murloc deck. It's a 1 mana 1/1. Deathspeaker, you can give a thing immune this turn. My understanding is that if your minion doesn't have Wind Fury, immune is just a worse version of Divine Shield, because it doesn't carry over between turns. But typically I think immune and Divine Shield are pretty comparable, so you kind of want to compare this to Argent Protector, which is a 2-mana 2/2 with basically the same battle cry. Is it worth paying 1 extra mana for 2 extra health? It could be. 2/4 on 3 is certainly better than a 2/2 on 2. But a lot of the problem with Argent Protector was that it was a 2-mana card, so it was really hard to play it on curve, and actually land it on a 1-drop that really wanted the Divine Shield. When you're playing this on turn 3, you can land its battle cry on a 2-drop, and that seems a lot more reasonable to me, as far as something you can actually trade with to get some value. And of course this is a neutral card and not a paladin card, but overall I don't really think it'll see that much play. Not a terrible card, but probably about the same power level as Argent Protector, and I can't remember the last time I saw that card in Constructed. Fallen Sun Cleric, so you can give a thing +1/+1. Kinda seems like a bummer when you compare it to Acherus Veteran, which is the same exact thing, but for 1 less mana you don't give a thing +1 health. Generally 2-drops that have only 1 health themselves are pretty terrible. They die to hero powers, they die to patches, they die to Maelstrom Portal. But giving something +1/+1 can be pretty disgusting if it allows it to make a good trade. This seems like a zoo card, so say you play a Flame Imp on 1, they play a thing with 2 power, and then you play Fallen Sun Cleric on turn 2, have your Flame Imp attack another 2 power thing, then you have 2 1-health things on the board, so it kinda makes their hero power a little bit worse. In that situation, your Flame Imp already got its value, and then they spend 2 mana hero powering it. The Fallen Sun Cleric gets to connect 1 more time, and if they're hero powering it again next turn, then whatever thing you played on turn 3 is getting to attack. I think it's probably not going to see much play. The fact that this thing only has 1 health probably just dooms this card. But if we've learned anything from Rockpool Hunter, a 2-drop that can give your 1-drop +1/+1 can snowball the game really hard. So I think this card is a little bit dangerous. Grave Shambler, so if you're playing this in Rogue, it's Inspire, give this thing +1/+1, with the slight upside that sometimes you get the +1/+1 right when this guy comes into play. If you're playing this anywhere else, it's a 4-mana 5/5 at best. Would you play a 4-mana 5/5? Probably not. And this thing isn't even a 4-mana 5/5 every time, so it just doesn't really seem worth playing. Grim Necromancer seems like a pretty reasonable card. At first it just kind of feels like a slight upgrade over Razorfin Hunter or Dragonling Mechanic, but getting the extra body on this card can be pretty relevant if you're playing a deck with Evolve or Flametongue Totem or Power of the Wild. Overall, I think it's probably not good enough to see play, but it is fair, and putting 3 things on the board at once is pretty solid. Notably, like Token Shaman and Aggro Druid don't really have 4-drops. Maybe someone will try this out, but I suspect it probably won't be quite good enough. Hyldnir Frostrider. So obviously you play this in your Murabi Shaman deck and win every game, because for 9 mana you get to cast Spirit Echo, and also lock your minions out of the game for a turn. Obviously outside of that OP combo, you don't really want to be playing this in a deck that has 2-drops, because you want to play this on curve and not actually freeze anything. In that case you're getting a 3-mana 4/4. Is 3-mana 4/4 good enough, even if it didn't have this garbage battle cry? Probably not. But we've never seen a vanilla 3-mana 4/4, so I'm not quite ready to write this card off. It could see some amount of play, I guess. When I was doing class cards, when I got to this point, I always did a recap of the 10 cards. Guess that doesn't really make too much sense in neutral, huh? Necrotic Geist. This is a 6-mana 5/3, so seems kinda bad. I think I'd have to ask myself why I wasn't just playing Cult Master. But this card is not completely without value. If you're up against a deck that looks to beat aggro by just playing a taunt, and making the aggro deck run all their things into it, then you can play this, run all your things into their taunt, and then you have a bunch more things. And then they play another taunt next turn, and then you run all your things into it, and you have a bunch more things. In that very specific instance, this card is powerful, but usually I think it just costs too much mana for what it does. So we've got Night Howler, which is a 4-mana 3/4, which I wouldn't play, or a 4-mana 5/3, which I wouldn't play, or a 4-mana 7/2, which I wouldn't play, and I think we get the point. Skelemancer, this card is kind of interesting. If it's your opponent's turn, you get to summon an 8/8 skeleton when this dies, so obviously they're never going to kill this if they can avoid it, so you need to try to force them to kill it somehow. You can try to use this as like an AoE blocker if you're playing an aggro deck, so you have all your things on the board and they're like, ha, I'm gonna AoE him this turn, and then you play this guy, and if they AoE you, you get 8/8 skeleton and you punch them in the face with it. But for 5 mana, you could just play an actual 8/8 with Bittertide Hydra, and that's only worse against like Equality and Brawl, and sometimes not even worse against Brawl. So in that instance, it seems like it's probably just worse than a 5 mana 8/8 we already have. You can also try to give it Taunt. It's particularly cute in Paladin because it curves into Spikeridge Steed, but damn if they silence that minion you feel bad, huh? And I don't think Paladin really even needs a card like this to trigger their Spikeridge Steed. If you want to play a durable 5-drop, I feel like Bolvar probably has more merit than this card. It's cute, but it's probably a little bit too hard to get the death rattle. Snowflipper Penguin is a Wisp with a Beast tag. Probably not very good, but you do always have to be concerned about 0 mana cards. You can use this and Wisp to OTK with Shadow Reaper Anduin and Prophet Velen. It's another thing for Hobgoblin in Wild. It gives you a sick Starving Buzzard combo. There are a lot of things you can do with this, but it seems like most of those things suck. But it is a 0 mana card in Hearthstone, and those tend to have the potential to be broken. Spellweaver is a 6 mana 4/4. If you want this spell damage effect, you just play Evolved Kobold instead. And to be fair, I did say that Evolved Kobold was trash, and it did end up seeing some play. But this card is definitely worse, because typically when you want spell damage, you want to use it that turn, so you'd rather just give up some stats for some more mana flexibility to play more spells. 6 mana 4/4. Sunborne Val'kyr. So this card is actually pretty reasonable. If you can consistently land this on 2 minions and get good trades with them because of it, I think this card is actually borderline playable and constructed. But if you're only landing this on like your 3/2 and trading it into their 2-power minion, then it's kind of like a 5 mana 5/4 summon a 3/2. That's only marginally better than, oh god, I can't even think of the card. 5 mana 4/4 summon a 2/2. I've seen it in Arena a few times when I played that game mode. Can't think of what it's called, but if you play this on only 1 minion, it's kinda like that a lot of times. But if you can consistently land this on 2 reasonable minions, it has the potential to be pretty solid. Even if you land it on some shitters, it can help keep them alive for like a Savage Roar or a Bloodlust. But it's kind of difficult to imagine a constructed environment where this is one of the 30 best cards you can put in your deck. Tainted Zealot. It's kind of an interesting spell damage minion, but typically you're not really looking for your spell damage to stick around. You kind of just want to play the thing with spell damage and then play the spells that deal damage, get your value, and then do other things next turn. As far as sticking around on the board, this is slightly better than Cobalt Geomancer, but Cobalt Geomancer only ever saw play because of how broken Spirit Claws was before that got nerfed. It does have some cute synergy with Defile. As long as you kill something with the initial 2, the Defile is always going to deal at least 5 damage, but I'm not sure that's really significant enough to make this card see play. Seems like a mediocre spell damage card. Tuskarr Fisherman is another take on the spell damage thing. It's a 2 mana 2/3 compared to Cobalt Geomancer's 2 mana 2/2. Makes it seem more reasonable. But typically when you're playing spell damage, you want to play spells that turn to blow up the board or kill your opponent in the face. And in that instance, you don't really care that much about the stats on your spell damage guy. This guy is better if you just have to play him out on turn 2 or whatever, but if you're just playing him out on turn 2, it's going to be pretty difficult to actually land the battle cry on something. I feel like I'd rather just have the consistency of knowing I'm actually going to have spell damage. Venomancer is a 5 mana 2/5, so probably unplayable. It kind of has infinite attack when dealing with minions, but it only has 2 power when it goes face. Doesn't really have any other synergies. It's pretty easy to kill a 5 health thing on turn 5. Vryghoul seems like it's worse than Scarlet Crusader and Eggnapper, and both of those cards are kinda trash. Don't really see a whole lot else to say about this guy. I guess he's a little bit better against Patches plus Maelstrom Portal. Wicked Skeleton is a 4 mana card that needs you to kill 4 minions this turn before it's reasonable, and that seems like a pretty big task for pretty little payoff. If this thing is anything less than a 5/5, it's unplayable and it's hard to make it a 5/5. Wretched Tiller is probably garbage. If it's going face, it's a 1 mana 3/1. If it's in combat, it's a 1 mana 1/1. If there's ever a world in Hearthstone where you can expect matchups where the opponent isn't playing minions in the early turn, this card could be a pretty reasonable aggro card, because if it's getting hero powered, it doesn't really matter that it only has 1 attack. But in a world where people actually use minions to trade, this card is never going to see play. And Hearthstone is pretty much all about using minions to trade, so this card is never going to see play. Bone Drake is another one of those cards that's kind of on the fringe of playability. If this guy wasn't a dragon himself, I would say he's probably not very good, because 6 mana 6/5 is kind of weak, the death rattle's pretty slow, and then usually the thing you get off the death rattle, you're going to have to pay like 9 mana to get value out of. But since he's a dragon, he activates Netherspite Historian. Maybe if you're trying to play dragons outside of Priest, and you need just like one more dragon activator in your deck, you can just play this guy. If every matchup is a control matchup, this guy can be used to get you another threat because most dragons tend to be pretty late game cards, but then you kind of have to wonder why you're not just picking a good late game card to put in your deck instead. Seems kinda reasonable if you desperately need the dragon tag, definitely won't see play other than that. Corpse Raiser is neutral Ancestral Spirit on a stick. I'm not really sure exactly what any class wants to do with this card, but it's certainly a powerful tool to have access to. You can try to slam this on a sick death rattle or maybe a thing with charge or something. There's certainly a lot of cute things you can do with this card, but you definitely need to be hitting a significant minion with it because 5 mana 3/3 is pretty garbage. Seems like a card that has some potential if you're looking to do a certain kind of combo. Happy Ghoul. So he costs 0 if you've been healed this turn. When you look at the text of if your hero has been healed this turn, you think of Priest. So Priest can trigger this with their hero power. If your opponent hits you in the face on turn 2, then you can just heal up and play a 0 mana 3/3, so basically 2 mana 3/3, heal yourself for 2. But if that becomes a thing, then people just won't attack Priest on turn 2. That's what people did against Patron Warrior with Battle Rage. But then if people start just not attacking you, then you can cut Happy Ghoul from your deck. And then when Happy Ghoul is out of the meta, you can put Happy Ghoul back in your deck, and then you can catch people off guard when they attack you in the face on turn 1. So it's kind of an interesting card in Priest. You can also play this in like Paladin, and your True Silver Champion can trigger it. You can play this in some deck that you're playing Lifesteal minions in, but I think generally it's going to be a little too difficult to use outside of Priest, because you're going to need to actually draw another card to activate this. Whereas Priest can just make this a 0 mana 3/3 every turn, as long as they've taken damage. The card is pretty interesting. I think Priests will definitely try it out, and it'll be interesting to see if any of the other classes can make it work. Keening Banshee is a 4 mana 5/5 in any class that's not going to fatigue. Is a 4 mana 5/5 good enough? Probably not. But maybe in certain aggro decks this card has some potential. Mindbreaker shuts off your hero power. So the thing about this card is if you play it on turn 3, where its 2/5 stats are relevant, nobody's hero powering at that point in the game anyway. If you play this on turn 10 when people are actually using their hero powers, it's a 3 mana 2/5, so they're just going to kill it. All the new Death Knights do have pretty powerful hero powers, but the decks that play them aren't going to be completely worthless without their hero power, and they're just going to be able to kill this and then use their hero power. Also, the art on this card does not look like something from Hearthstone. I guess that doesn't affect how good it is, though. Phantom Freebooter I actually think is kind of interesting. Pirate decks already play Naga Corsair, which is a 4 mana 5/4 that sometimes does a thing if you have a weapon on the board. This thing is a 4 mana 3/3 that does a thing if you have a weapon on the board, but the ceiling for this card is a lot higher. If you have a Fiery War Axe in play, this guy is a 6/5, whereas Naga Corsair is a 5/5. And a lot of times Naga Corsair just makes your damage do 1 extra damage once, so it's kind of comparable. But if you've got, say, a full Rusty Hook, this is a 4 mana 4/6, which is potentially better than the Naga Corsair. If you want to play this in Rogue with Obsidian Shard, it can be a 4 mana 6/6. If there's a Doomhammer in play, it's a 5/11 minion, and a 5/11 minion is pretty strong. I think there's some potential for this card, mostly because it's a pirate, so if you need a little bit of extra pirate synergy, I think you could look to this, but most of the time it's just a pile of stats, so probably not too good. I wouldn't be amazed if it saw play in a Pirate Rogue, or maybe even replace the Naga Corsair and Pirate Warrior. I do expect that Naga Corsair will probably end up being the better card, though. Saronite Chain Gang actually seems like a pretty decent card. 4 mana for 2/2/3 taunts, kind of reminiscent of Feral Spirits. This has some synergy with hand buffs, it has some synergy with Evolve. but it's also just pretty good value for 4 mana. If you're playing a deck that wants a taunt on turn 4, this is probably better than Sinjin. Not really a whole lot to say about this card other than it seems solid on its own, and it does have like Evolve and Hand Buff synergy. And even like Power of the Wild synergy, I guess. Seems like it'll probably find a home somewhere, I have to imagine. Shallow Gravedigger is a 3 mana 3/1, so card is definitely trash. It draws you a card, but the +1 mana for +1 attack doesn't seem worth it for a Loot Hoarder, which is going to draw you a better card on average. There's some potential for this to be Quest Priest's version of Quest Warrior's Stonehill Defender, where it's 2 things for your quest and 1 card, but it's 3 mana 3/1, so definitely not going to be seeing too much play. Taking Abomination, our Lord and Savior. When do you ever want to be dealing 5 damage to your minions? I guess you can play it with Devilsaur Egg, but in general, I think if you're looking to play this card, it's probably in a deck that's not expecting to have any minions on the board on turn 4. So maybe something like Miracle Rogue, which might have played a Swashbuckler on turn 1, but really nothing else. Maybe something like Priest that didn't want to play their Cleric on turn 1. It is a 4 mana 5/6 in those kinds of decks. Is there a deck like that that's going to exist? I don't really expect there to be. If it does, is Ticking Abomination going to be one of the 30 best cards you could put in that deck? Probably not. But if it finds the right deck, it is a 4 mana 5/6. Wouldn't be surprised if this card ended up seeing a little bit of play. So Corpsetaker is an actual interesting neutral legendary. It could be a 4 mana 3/3 Taunt, Divine Shield, Lifesteal, Wind Fury. You're never going to give this Wind Fury unless you're playing Alikir, because literally every other Wind Fury minion is garbage. The class that this is definitely best in is Paladin, because you get Taunt, Divine Shield, Lifesteal off Wickerflame Burn Bristle, you get Taunt, Divine Shield off Tyrion, and you can potentially be playing like 1 Divine Shield thing and some Stonehill Defenders, and maybe like a Chillblade Champion, and then you can actually just assemble the Taunt, Divine Shield, and Lifesteal from different minions. And I think in Paladin this card is definitely worth playing, because much of the time it's going to be a 4 mana 3/3 Wickerflame Burn Bristle, which is a reasonable card. I think it is probably going to be a little bit difficult to make this work in any class other than Paladin, because every Wind Fury minion other than Alikir is trash, and I'm not really sure that Shaman wants this card. It's hard for them to be playing Divine Shields, and off the top of my head I think every Lifesteal minion other than Wickerflame Burn Bristle is pretty garbage. So it seems like it'll probably be difficult to get multiple triggers out of this in anything other than Paladin. But the card seems really strong in Paladin, and it'll definitely be interesting to see if someone can make it work somewhere else. Deathaxe Punisher. I hope this card is good because I got like 6 of these fuckers from my packs. But unfortunately he's trash. He only buffs Lifesteal minions, and there are so few playable Lifesteal minions that it's actually going to be pretty difficult to play this and actually get the buff out of it. Even if you are getting the buff, it's kind of only a 4 mana 5/5, even though the +2/+2, since it's landing on a Lifesteal minion, is worth slightly more than just +2/+2. But it's never actually landing on a Lifesteal minion, because you're not actually playing that many Lifesteal minions, and this is a 4 mana 3/3, so it's garbage. Drakkari Enchanter. So people look at this card and they think of Bran Bronzebeard, but there are a couple problems with that. The most notable one is end of turn effects are a lot harder to come by than battle cries. There's like Lich King, there's Ysera and Yashiraj and all that kind of stuff, but that stuff all costs too much mana to play in the same turn as this, and that's really the strength of these kinds of effects. Maybe Shaman could get some use out of this with like Manatide Totem, or maybe in some instances even the Healing Totem, but end of turn effects are hard to come by, and ones that you can actually use with this card are even harder to come by. And I think the other mistake that people make when looking at this card is thinking that Bran Bronzebeard was some like super good card. Bran was in Standard for like almost a year before it even saw any play, and the only reason it actually saw play in Mean Streets of Gadgetzan is because Kazakus' Battle Cry and the entire Jade Golem mechanic are actually like the most broken shit that's ever been printed in Hearthstone, and there's no end of turn effect really that's on par with those, other than the gigantic ones that cost 8 mana and you can never actually combo with this. So yeah, it's a cute card. I'll be interested to see if I or someone else can make it work, but I don't really see it working out too well. Furnacefire Colossus is a 6 mana pile of stats. that makes you discard all the weapons in your hand when it's destroyed by Vile Spineslayer or targeted by Hex. Seems like a pretty bad effect. But the 4% of games where your opponent doesn't have hard removal when you play this, it can be pretty fat. Just play this shit and discard your Doomhammer and you're good to go, right? It's just a pile of stats, but sometimes it's a really big pile of stats. Meat Wagon is probably trash, but it's definitely a cute card. As a 1-power minion, you can use it with Validated Doomsayer, but Validated Doomsayer is trash even if you pull it off this. Your opponent can sometimes just trade into it. I don't really see that being a thing. You can't really play this in a hand buff deck, because in a hand buff deck, you typically want to be playing a bunch of little dudes that are worth hand buffing. I think the most interesting thing I've thought of with this card is playing it in the Shadow Essence Priest deck with something like Ysera. So you either Shadow Essence out your Ysera, or you miss and hit Meat Wagon, and then when the Meat Wagon dies, you would pull your actual Ysera. Could be cute. This card has a lot of potential to do different things, but in the end I think the things this thing does probably won't even be that good. Nerubian Unraveler is a 6-mana 5/5. That's Sylvanas' stat line, that's Emperor Thoris's stat line. So we know that a 6-mana 5/5 is playable if the text is crazy, and the text on this card is not crazy, so it's probably unplayable. But if there is a metagame where there are a lot of spell-heavy decks, if Miracle Rogue is literally everywhere, this thing can really mess up a Miracle Rogue's turn. This thing isn't nearly as convenient to remove as Doomed Apprentice. So against spell-heavy combo decks, I could see this seeing play, but it's hard to imagine an environment where you don't just play this and then it dies to a 5-power Paladin weapon or something like that. Rattling Rascal does a thing for you when it comes into play, and then does a thing for your opponent when it leaves play. You can play this in Silence Priest to try to get rid of the Death Rattle, but you probably just have better things to silence. Although I guess if you don't have your silence, this card isn't literally worthless, like some of the other silence targets are. You can play this with Treachery, so then you get both of the 5/5 skeletons, which is actually kind of interesting. But if you could just combine all the text on this card, it is a 4-mana 2/2, which seems pretty bad. Sure, you get your 5/5 first, they get theirs later, which does give you a slight advantage, but it's probably just never going to quite be worth it. You can also evolve this guy, I guess, but still not really worth it, I think. Skulking Geist is kind of a weird card. It seems that it is obviously targeted at killing Jade Idol, but it does have a few other applications like killing Inner Fire from combo priests. If Rogue goes into the triple Cold Blood on my Southsea Deckhand combo route, then you can just get rid of their Cold Bloods with this. Against most decks other than combo priest and Jade Druid, it's probably not going to be too impactful though. And the thing is, against Jade Druid, usually you lose to them just like playing things over and over again. It's not necessarily the fact that they're just not fatiguing because of Jade Idol, but it's also kind of possible that you're never losing to infinite Jade Idols, because if you try to win that game in Fatigue, you're just going to lose, so nobody ever plays decks like that. And this guy does open up the space to try to play a deck like that. A control warrior that just tries to kill everything, a control priest that just tries to kill everything. That was never possible against Jade Druid before, and now there is some hope of it working. In those decks, there's also the potential that your opponent just plays Gadgetzan Auctioneer and they make a million Jade Golems, and this is in the bottom third of your deck and you still lose. But it's nice to have a card that you can put in your control deck and not feel like conceding on turn 1 when they play Jade Idol. Not sure how competitive this card will be because it's only relevant in a couple matchups, and in the other ones it's a 6-mana 4/6, but I'm definitely going to be playing this in my Dead Man's Hand deck and my Archbishop Benedictus deck. You can also try to use this kind of like Hemet Jungle Hunter if your deck has like a bunch of 1-cost spells in it, but what class really has enough 1-cost spells to use this like that? What advantage do you really gain by doing that? Is this card really even better than Hemet Jungle Hunter in that deck? I mean, I guess you can only play one Hemet, so maybe you just play both? I don't know. I don't really see that being a thing. I think you play this card if you want to go to Fatigue and you're sick of Jade Druid, basically. Tomb Lurker is a 5-mana 5/3 draw card. Lotus Agents was garbage. This is probably garbage. This also has the potential to not even draw you a card if a Death Rattle minion hasn't died this game. You can't even necessarily rig this because it can steal your opponent's Death Rattle minions too. So even if you're just trying to play a bunch of Tyrians this game, sometimes you get a Kindly Grandmother instead. Or sometimes it's a 5-mana 5/3 do nothing. Card is trash, I think. we'll give it a hot 1-star rating. So we're on to the legendaries finally. Prince Keleseth, 2 mana 2/2, can't play any other 2-cost cards. The thing about the condition on this card is, most decks want to play 2-cost cards, so it's hard to work this in somewhere. The deck that really stands out to me with this card is Quest Hunter, because you want to be playing a bunch of 1-drops and not necessarily 2-drops, but I don't think this card really solves the problem with Quest Hunter, which is that your quest sucks. But this card is probably at its best in that deck. You can also just try to play this in a deck that does have 2-cost cards, and then just try to draw your other 2-cost cards before you want to play this. But this prince in particular, you really want to be playing early in the game so you can actually get those buffs online and have time to play your minions and use those buffs. So it's unlikely that you'd be able to draw your other 2-cost cards by then. This guy is a legendary, meaning he's a 1-of, so he's actually pretty difficult to draw early on. And if you don't draw him, you're just kind of playing a bad deck since you're forcing yourself not to play any 2-drops. It's just weird for this card to have the condition that it does when you really want to play it on turn 2, but a deck that could really make use of this card wants other 2-drops. Probably won't see too much play. Prince Taldaram, 3 mana 3/3, kind of a Faceless Manipulator, but you don't copy the stats. I think this card actually has some potential. If there's a card you really want to copy, like say Prophet Velen or something like that, where you don't really care about the stats, this is just a Faceless Manipulator for 2 less mana. Typically Faceless Manipulator has really only seen play in combos where you actually do want the stats, so it's kind of hard to imagine the exact place that this would want to see play. But if there's a big minion that you really want to copy the text on, I guess you could even use this with like Karen Bloodhoof or something like that to copy a Death Rattle, then I could actually see this card seeing play. It's pretty cheap for what it can theoretically do in terms of ridiculous combos. And compared to the other princes, since I think this is mostly a combo card, I think it's actually somewhat reasonable to play this in a deck with other 3-cost cards, and then you're just trying to save this for late game, wait till you've naturally drawn your Tar Creepers or whatever you're playing. I think this card definitely has some potential in certain combo decks, but you definitely need to have something specific in mind. This isn't just like a good card to play on turn 3 or something like that. Prince Valanar. So my issue with this card is, if this was just a 4 mana 4/4 taunt lifesteal, would I even play it then? Sinjin Shieldmast is not really playable, and a 4 mana 3/5 taunt is better than a 4 mana 4/4 taunt, and I don't think lifesteal is really that valuable. So this card would probably be better than Sinjin, but not that much in most classes. There are a few classes that are pretty desperate for healing, so maybe Rogue or Warlock would really be looking for a 4 mana 4/4 taunt lifesteal. But with the condition on this card, Warlock would have to give up their Twilight Drakes, they'd have to give up their Hellfire, and I'm not sure they're really ready to make those concessions. Rogue doesn't really necessarily have mandatory 4-drops, so maybe Rogue is willing to play this since they don't really have to make compromises for it and they are one of the classes that really values the lifesteal. Can't really imagine it being too good outside of Rogue, but if you happen to be building a deck and at the end it doesn't have 4-drops in it, then maybe you can be like, oh okay, I can just play Prince Valanar. Or if you only have 1 4-drop in that deck, then maybe you think to yourself, is this card better than Prince Valanar? But compared to the other 2 princes, the effect on this card is much, much more tame, so it's a little bit more difficult to really justify altering your deck so much for this card. Arfus is a cute little ghost puppy, but unfortunately I don't think he's much more than that. The Death Knight cards are pretty broken, but they're broken because they don't cost enough mana for what they do, and with Arfus you're basically just paying up front for those. You're paying 3 more mana than this card is worth to get a Death Knight card that's probably not worth 3 mana more than what it costs. There's also the issue that if you're ever playing this card, it's an extremely slow meta, because that's the only way you could justify something like this, and in an extremely slow meta there are likely to be priests, and this card is literally unplayable against priests because of Potion of Madness and other similar effects. So it basically probably just costs too much for what it does. And we're on to the last card, the Lich King himself. This guy kind of makes me wonder if he was the reason that Ragnaros rotated out of Standard, because he seems like 8 mana put this in every deck that lives until turn 8, which is basically what Ragnaros was. I guess Ragnaros did have some use in aggro decks or mid-range decks that wanted to end the turn on turn 8, and Lich King doesn't really do that. But every deck that's looking to survive past turn 8 is probably going to play this card. The Death Knight cards are really broken in the same way that Dream cards are, and unlike on Arfus, you don't really give up much to get those effects when you're playing Lich King. This is an 8 mana 8/8 taunt, so it's actually playable against aggro because it has 8 health and taunt. And against control, an 8/8 is actually not always going to be that easy to kill. So this guy generates a lot of value, he's got a reasonable body, he's not dead against aggro. So yeah, you probably just play this guy in every deck that's looking to go past turn 8. The Lich King is definitely in the conversation for best card in the set. I think I am ever so slightly less impressed by this card than most people seem to be, but it's definitely going to be seeing a lot of play. So that's it, that's the set review. The set's already out because Blizzard only gave me 3 days to actually do this review, so after I finish editing this, I can actually go play the expansion. And we've definitely seen some interesting cards, so pretty excited to get my hands on them.